For the next few minutes, we're going to go over a topic that has come up a lot recently, and that is the idea of under-editing versus over-editing and undernoting versus overnoting. As far as under-editing goes, this means that you are not doing as much as expected with your edits. And under-editing can happen during the first pass or the second pass. But especially for the first pass, you want to make sure that you edit enough to complete the project appropriately. Under-editing happens when you don't edit after paragraphs, when you don't edit at punch marks, which are the red slashes or marks on a script from the directors. If you leave distracting breaths in when room tone would be more professional, that means you're under-editing. When you don't edit distracting movement or mouth noise out of a project, that is also under-editing. And if you leave pauses in that are obviously wrong, that will be noted as an under-edit. And if someone can scan through and see that you have sections of 20 seconds or longer in your session with no edits, chances are that you are under-editing. On the other side of the scale, there is over-editing. One way you can over-edit is by replacing room tone with room tone. This is not necessary. Over-editing also happens if you replace natural sounding breaths with blank room tone. You also don't need to do that. If you're doing any adjusting of spacing or pacing by less than 0.2 seconds, so if you take out a space that's 65 milliseconds and put in one that's 85 milliseconds, no one can really hear that, so that's unnecessary. Essentially, if you're spending time on details that don't affect the production quality of the end product, there's no reason to be doing that. The net result of over-editing is you are wasting your time, and you may even be creating potential deadline issues if you don't turn things in when you should because you're spending so much time on the edit. Who cares about over-editing and under-editing? You need to find the good pocket between those two, because if you noticeably under-edit, then the people after you have to do work that you should have done. If the people after you feel that you have not done editing properly, they can and they will ungroup and check your work. You don't really want to be under that kind of a microscope. You don't want to give anyone the reason to see if you're doing what you should be doing. In extreme cases, you will get your projects kicked back at you to re-edit. If an under-edited project goes all the way to the client or the publisher, everyone loses. The company looks bad, you look bad, anyone who's checked your work after you looks bad. Any kind of an under-edit gives the impression that the company's doing a less than professional job. On the other side, if you over-edit, the people after you aren't going to recognize the extra time and effort you put into the project. Overall, if your edits don't increase the value of the production, don't do them. Now we get to under and over notating. As far as undernotating goes, you have to include all of the information necessary about a pickup. And that includes both in the session and on the PDF. You have to assume that the people after you need to know everything important, and the narrator needs to know everything important as well. We'll put a few examples up soon about what it means to not have a clear enough pickup illustration, and mispronunciations are the big one. If you edit a session and note 4 pickups, and the second pass person after you finds another 50, you are probably undernotating. This suggests that you're editing at too fast of a speed or aren't in a good listening environment. Yes, the first pass should focus on the pacing and spacing, but that doesn't mean that you can ignore misreads or other pickups that you run into. If you're paying a reasonable amount of attention, you should at least get 50% of what will ultimately be the pickups of a session. If you add notes in a session or in a PDF with the assumption that someone knows what you're talking about with limited information, you are undernotating. Even if information was in an email thread or in a private message, you have to make sure that everything required for your pickup is present in the session and on the PDF. You don't want to make people guess. Overnotating. The biggest overnotating issue is when an editor marks every instance of what they believe is a mispronunciation without looking it up or checking the word list. If you've heard a word your entire life one way and you run into a situation where a narrator is saying it a different way, and that happens 100 times, and you mark all 100 of them, but then later find out that the way that they pronounced it was a legitimate pronunciation, that's an overnotating mistake. If you mark 30 instances of mouth noise when you can edit those mouth noises out, that's overnotating. If you put more information in the session or on the PDF than you need to, that's overnotating. You shouldn't have to have sentences explaining what's going on. Lastly, marking pickups of instances where production quality would not change if a re-record were done is overnotating. If you have 40 pickups that say noise after word, but that noise is part of the narrator's speech pattern, that's overnotating. Who cares about how well you notate? If you undernotate, the people after you have to do the work you should have done. The people after you have to guess what you mean about things. People can assume that you don't understand what your job is, and that can affect future assignments. Also, publishers will skewer you for an undernotated project. Eventually, a client expects all of the issues fixed or marked in their session. In an undernotated project, there will be lots of publisher pickups that get kicked back. On the other side, if you overnotate, the people after you have to check and delete all of your unnecessary notes. This can take a really long time. If you have a lot of overnotated marks, all of those have to be checked individually because you don't want to pass a project on back to a narrator or a director and have them say that it's not something that should be there. If you leave too much information in, the people after you have to decide what to ignore. Again, this is a big waste of time. Keep the amount of information exactly as detailed as you need, but no more. Also, overnotated projects have a ton of clutter, which leads to the chance of missing errors. The people who get the most upset about overnotated projects are the narrators, especially when it has something to do with a speech pattern or a dialect or a pronunciation that isn't actually a problem. You don't want to mark things that don't need to get fixed. That was a quick rundown about underediting versus overediting, undernoting versus overnoting. Questions about this come up every day. The more you work on projects, the better you'll be able to figure out where the good medium ground is between those options.